Hello and welcome to the Healthcare Today podcast. Our guest today is Isobel Egemole, an investment director specialising in healthtech at London VC firm IW Capital. Femtech serves more than half the global population, and its market is growing 60% faster than the rest of healthcare. However, in 2024, it attracted less than 1/10 of digital health funding. Here, Isobel discusses why Femtech founders can't afford to wait for investors to wake up, while revealing how they can pitch their way past the blind spots. In an article you wrote for Healthcare Today, you said that Femtech is less a gap than an opportunity hiding in plain sight. Why do so many venture capitalists still treat Femtech as niche when women obviously drive over 60% of pharma revenue for top companies?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. I think probably female founders and particularly in femtech and women's health are fed up of hearing, oh, there's a big opportunity. We had the McKinsey report in 2024, which outlined it as over $1 trillion opportunity. But then as much as we've seen a positive trend in investment going into the space, it's still a fraction of the percent when you look at the amount of private capital that goes into companies. So I think that niche part comes from almost not seeing women's health. So femtech in itself, the name for it was only coined in 2016 from a female founder building in the space. So when you look at how VCs work, we use a lot of data platforms that track it. And if that term was only coined in 2016, we're not seeing the full extent of the space. And that's compounded when you look at femtech and everyone immediately thinks, okay, fertility. But actually, when you look at women's health, it's a lot wider than that. There's conditions that are unique to women, and conditions that affect women differently, and then conditions that affect women disproportionately. So a big one is cardiovascular disease, which I think it's twice the amount of women are affected by compared to men, but there's never been much emphasis on how do we treat this differently with women. So when you have a sector that's been historically underserved in each case, from research all the way up to when private capital markets get involved, everyone's going to say, okay, it's niche because the examples aren't there. But what we can do is keep building on that and change that miscategorization to just seeing it as reproductive and fertility health. Actually, it's a whole host of conditions here that affect women. And that's what the focus should be, rather than just categorizing it in one subsector of women's health.
With women making up only 17% of partners at large firms, you've acknowledged that unfamiliarity drives perceived risk. However, you have argued that the answer isn't to make the problem more relatable, it's to make the commercial case undeniable. How do you do that without losing the human urgency of the problem?
I think this is the key bit, because it's not either or in choosing which one and losing that side of the story. In VC and whoever's pitching to us, it all does come down to the storytelling. So if a female founder's coming in, and a lot of femtech companies and women's health companies are founded by women, it's using that story as an anchor to really show that you have that authority in the problem. Yes, I've experienced this, and this is how I know that the opportunity exists. But then it's not leaving it there with the story. It's then how you translate that to commercial. So, for example, I think if you're building in the space on endometriosis, something that affects 1 in 10 women in the UK, you think that's quite, I suppose, a big stat to have in your deck. But an investor who has probably never heard of it before will sit there and be like, okay, and so what? So it's really educating the room and using your story to initially bring the problem. I've experienced it and I know there's a gap here. And actually, I'm not the only one, 1 in 10 women. And then you take it further and say, okay, how does that become a commercial impact? So I think the stats on endometriosis, it costs the UK economy over 8.2 billion a year. Suddenly that's your personal story going into something that's not a niche. It's a huge market, and there's many women that have experienced the problem. And because of everything that's been underserved, this is why now is the opportunity for your company to operate in that space.
Data suggests that femtech companies face a higher diligence burden than comparable digital health startups, as you've just spoken to. Practically speaking, and this may be an unanswerable question, but what should a founder have in their pitch deck to make them fully bulletproof? Is it the storytelling angle, or is it stats? What is it?
It's a mixture of both. It's when you're in that first meeting with an investor, it's that storytelling piece and how you bring slides to life. So, and also how VC firms work. Often the person that you have that first meeting with isn't the person making the ultimate decision. So your story's got to resonate with them, who they need to go share it internally with the rest of the VC firm. So the key thing is, I think we just have to, as much as we want to drive change in the VC industry, women that want to raise now need to know how to deal with it as it is. So I think go into putting your pitch together, knowing that there's going to be more diligence, and assume that diligence up front. And then when you're putting it together, just make sure that everything you're putting there, you have, the clinical evidence there, the revenue model there, even if you're not at that stage yet, showing this is how we think it's going to sell, this is who we think we're going to sell to. And really, when you're particularly on the market side, to get over that niche comment, is this is how we've broken down the market. These are external sources. It's not just internal data that we've used to build our addressable market. And then also in women's health, especially, you need to know what that regulatory pathway is. So you're coming and you're saying you have this product, you think it's really needed, but actually it can't go to market and no one can buy it because it doesn't have the regulatory approval. So it's knowing what each of those routes are for you and for each market that you want to be into. So if you're going into the US, it's knowing your FDA pathway. If you need to use reimbursement codes, knowing what your routes are with that. Is there existing codes you can use? And showing that you've thought of how you need to work at each stage and knowing that commercial scale up. I think that's the key part for the founders to get across, that they have that authority, they know the market, and they know exactly how they scale their product to be able to be successful and ultimately find a buyer is the key part. And health system sales are, a complete different ball game. You're not just talking to one person who can make that buying decision. So, and this is probably not the part for that initial pitch, but shows that when you're speaking, you've thought about each stakeholder that you need to address with your product, and how for each person you sell it differently. So for the clinician, this is why they want to buy it. But for the finance team at the healthcare system, this is why they want to buy it. And having that story for each stakeholder and have it mapped out, and really just showing that you know how it gets to market.
I think there are some success stories, so it proves that it can be done. You've highlighted hormone and fertility test business Hertility and femtech firm Peppy as companies that got the signaling right. To your mind, what did they do to convert investor hesitation into confidence?
Yes, I think Hertility is a good one, because that's got two great female founders. I think it's three actually, and they didn't lose sight of what that story was in building the company. But then when you speak to an investor about it, how you frame it to make sure that it, I suppose, resonates with that audience, it's very much actually it's not just fertility for women. We're a diagnostics infrastructure, and they had the lab and clinical data to support it. And then it moves into, we know who we're selling to, it comes in as a B2B employee benefit. So then it becomes more, okay, as an investor, I can understand this. They're offering this platform, which is clinically validated. So from the product side, then they also know who they're selling to, and they know the pathway into those customers. And they also know the budget that it's coming from. It's an employee benefit. That's how we're getting to market, as well as D2C. So it's coming with the story, but then also how that story develops into both a commercial case and then finding the buyer for that commercial case.
That leads me very nicely into the next question, where I'll be quoting you back at yourself. You said there is a version of every femtech pitch that only lands for people who have lived the problem. Then there is a version that lands for a mixed room of investors who may never have. How do you build the second without necessarily betraying the first?
Yeah, and this comes back to that piece on the storytelling. I mean, really use, especially if you do have a personal story, really use that to anchor your authority in the problem. I've been through this. I've seen what the pain was, and I know what the existing solutions or offerings or treatment plan, whatever it is, I know what that is. And actually, then when you look at it from a market view, this affects X amount of people. So it's not just you that has that story, but then it's translating that to commercial terms. So it's almost, you show that that opportunity exists because you had that pain when you had the problem. And then that becomes your story. But yeah, I think just using it to frame the pitch rather than just using it and then thinking that's enough, that has to be the why. And then you move to the what and how.
Keeping the storytelling angle going, you noted that Flow Health, Europe's first femtech unicorn, was founded by men. What does that tell us about the difference between a female founder story and a scalable investment thesis? Are female founders being held to a different narrative standard?
I think this one's interesting because it also ties into female founders who are in the space who aren't building in women's health or in femtech. There's lots of female founders building in different sectors. And it's almost that expectation that a female founder, if they're building in women's health and femtech, has to have a personal story. And it's actually, why should female founders have to wear both those hats, where they're both the story behind it and also the one scaling the business? They don't have to be the same. And I think Flow Health shows us that, because the men, they don't have that problem, but they saw the commercial scale of the opportunity. So whilst female founders that do have that story use it to their advantage, but it's also not a explicit requirement that you have to have both to have an investable thesis. But yeah, it's using the research on female founders as a whole and the questions that they typically get asked. So there's the study, I think it's Columbia Research, where they looked at the questions female founders get asked versus male founders, and how they're more prevention questions rather than actually what's the scale of this and how do we promote this as a category. So female founders shouldn't have to prove their story to build in femtech and in the women's health space. But if they do have the story, use it to your advantage in that framing of your pitch.
Looking at investor confidence, the government's renewed women's health strategy and increased interest in women's health hubs. Do you feel that it's going to genuinely move the needle for investable femtech, or is it still too early to change VC behavior?
I think it's a good signal, because what it helps proving is that the demand is there and the procurement's there, and hopefully eventually there's going to be a buyer there. So again, it's that stage where we've got lots of women's health companies in pre-seed and seed stage, and they've not done the commercial scale up yet. When a VC speaks to them, you're like, okay, who's the buyer of this? Who's paying for it? When historically we've seen lower budgets in women's health and there hasn't been an explicit strategy that's going to fund that. It's a good policy signal that we now have explicit funding going into this. So hopefully gives investors more confidence that, okay, there is an eventual buyer for this. If we get to this stage where we're ready for commercial scale, there's a buyer at the end of it.
Major pharma companies like Eli Lilly, Merck, Johnson & Johnson are starting to recycle capital back into femtech. Again, on the subject of investor confidence, do you feel this focus will pull VCs along too?
Absolutely. And I think this one's maybe even more of an indicator than the changing government spending, because ultimately, when we're looking at these VC investments, we're thinking, where's the exit? And when you're seeing big pharma going into women's health and invest heavily into it, that's what's going to push VCs like, okay, maybe we've got the next one that they might be interested in acquiring. And how do we get into it early? So I think that's a good indication in terms of pharma, and especially their corporate venture vehicles. They're probably 12 to 24 months ahead of generalist VC market, because they know what their parent company is looking for and where their strategy is headed. And as they write bigger checks, it gives a VC investor more confidence that, okay, there is an exit route here because I know XYZ players are interested in this space and will be looking for certain companies in different subsectors of women's health that matches up with their ultimate strategy.
Finally, you've said that the funding circle that will correct this market has to start somewhere. Where is that somewhere in 2026? Is it a particular sector, say fertility, menopause, maternity tech, or a particular business model, or a particular geography?
I think geography, best place to start, the UK. In the UK, we house, I think it's 31.8% of the femtech market of Europe is in the UK. The UK has, hopefully now with the NHS strategy on women's health, is putting more investment into research. We've got top universities here pushing that research. And hopefully that's going to be the place where we start seeing new innovations that aren't just another wellness product, but actually clinically validated solutions for women's health. As that research improves and grows, we get more companies get into that commercial scale and hopefully have that investment coming in. So I think the UK market is a good place to start. And sector-wise, I think we've seen a lot of movement in the menopause market recently. I mean, there's a good underwriting story there, especially with you see the big mega trends and everyone's focused on aging populations. Part of that aging population is obviously going to be women, which is expected to be over 1 billion women in peri or post-menopause by 2030. So there's already going to be a huge market case there. And people we're seeing more from the corporate world, which is interested in terms of changing employee benefits and how they can help their workers. So that supports that, okay, there's a buyer there in that space as well. So it's for whichever company's ready to take advantage of that and build a solution that works for the women, but also know that there's someone there to buy it and have a commercial story there.
Isobel, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate talking to you.
Thanks, Glenn.